You know, something I really appreciated about the older Clock Tower games, beyond their incredibly underrated influence on the horror genre of course, was the setting. The first few games were set in Norway, so the architecture had a very distinct European style, something you don't often see in video games as a whole, I would argue. A lot of horror games tend to either go for a generic American setting or a generic Japanese setting, so it really helped these games stand out from the crowd, at least in the earlier titles in the franchise. This is largely thanks to the works of Dario Argento, an Italian film director who released a number of pretty well-known horror films in the 70s and 80s, serving as a massive source of inspiration for the Clock Tower franchise. Phenomena and Suspiria, which would probably be Argento's most well-known films, are great examples of the Italian film genre known as giallo. Giallo is just the Italian word for the colour yellow, and apparently the term takes its inspiration from a series of Italian crime mystery pulp novels released in the 1920s and 30s that always made use of yellow cover art. As the decades went by, yellow, and therefore giallo, became synonymous with the mystery thriller hybrid genre. The simplest way to describe giallo cinema is murder mystery meets horror. There's usually a killer or villain whose identity isn't revealed until the very end, and there's plenty of gruesome deaths along the way before we find out who that killer is, like the mystery of a whodunit mixed with the violence of a slasher movie. Take Phenomena, for example, released in 1985. Jennifer Connelly plays a character who has psychic powers that allow her to communicate with bugs and insects, and she makes use of this ability to track down a serial killer who's been murdering young women in a small Swiss town. While the genre may sound outdated now, it more or less laid the groundwork for the slasher genre as we know it today. When you look at Scream, for example, it shares an awful lot of similarities to most giallo films. Not only Scream, but Clock Tower as well. Plenty of grisly deaths, check. Murderous villain who we don't really know the real identity of until close to the end, check. I mean, dude, look at Jennifer Connelly's character in Phenomena next to Jennifer in the game. The SNES Clock Tower is a total love letter to giallo and Dario Argento's work in particular. But as the franchise went on, I would argue that Clock Tower lost its giallo roots, and look, hey, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I think that format would probably lose its charm if every single entry was like that, but it would have been cool to see a modern game harken back to those giallo roots. I guess you could argue Haunting Ground has some vague nods considering the characters all have Italian names, but it's loose at best. And Nightcry certainly doesn't have anything like that, but then again, Nightcry doesn't really have many things going for it. Enter Chris Darrell, an Italian game developer who started creating a fan remake of the original Clock Tower in 2007 called Remothered, making use of the RPG Maker XP engine. While the game was indeed an homage to the SNES title, its faithfulness to the original changed as the years went on. Remothered had 3 known versions during its many years of development, with the most well documented of them being version 2.
Dakota Rang for TVC speaking. We are in the middle of the Norwegian countryside beyond the mountains in Romsdalen, close to the property of the Barrowses, a long-time aristocratic family, in the mansion also known as the Clock Tower.
This game looked like it could have been really cool too, maintaining a point-and-click style of gameplay but with beautiful oil-painted visuals, giving it its own unique style and identity compared to the SNES. There was even a track on the OST that was going to be a direct remake of the Scissorman's chase music. But in fairness, the game was probably a little too similar to Clock Tower, at least legally speaking, and these builds of Remothered were unfortunately scrapped by 2012. That's not to say Remothered was abandoned though. Chris Darrell powered on with the project regardless, with Remothered being revamped once again, this time with the help of Italian indie game studio Storemind Games, and finally releasing in 2018 as Remothered Tormented Fathers, over 10 years since the entire project was first revealed to the world in 2007. This time the game is fully in 3D, a pretty substantial graphical upgrade from the simple 2D visuals from before. The story and characters have all been totally changed here too, now with a completely new narrative that still pays homage to its Clock Tower and giallo roots. Chris Darrell has said a handful of other horror gems influence Remothered as well, like Haunting Ground and its PS2 contemporary Rule of Rose also being big influences, as well as classic horror and thriller films such as Silence of the Lambs, Rosemary's Baby, and Twin Peaks. This is a pretty great selection of films and games to draw inspiration from. I mean, I might be biased because Silence of the Lambs is one of my favourite films ever, but regardless, let's get right into it. Let's see what's the story with Remothered Tormented Fathers. We boot up the game and, my god, yep, no, the second we get to the main menu, I can see those influences already. That's just straight up Jodie Foster. We start off with a young man interviewing an elderly lady who calls herself Madame Svenska. She begins to recount a story from when she was younger and we're taken back to the year 1992. Let me remind you that this is technically an indie title, but holy shit, the graphics look insane, like really, really impressive, especially when combined with the cutscene direction. And oh, Nobuko Toda, we meet again. Anyone who watched my Nightcray video should be familiar with this name. She was one of the composers for that game and has a really impressive track record, having worked on the likes of Metal Gear Solid, Ghost in the Shell, and even Star Wars. I ain't judging you for working on Nightcray, Queen. You get that bag. Anyway, so our protagonist, Rosemary Reed, is a doctor visiting Richard Felton, a man who suffers from a very rare, strange disease. At the door, we meet his nurse Gloria, who escorts us to his office, and looking around this room, we find, okay, this is a hefty document right here, but it provides us with some very valuable exposition. We learn that Richard Felton and his wife used to own a farm before it closed down due to suspected contamination with phenoxyl, an experimental drug made using a specific species of moth. The contaminated water affected many of the workers and a nearby convent as well, making them all unwilling test subjects. At least that's what I think I can take from this. Not gonna lie, this note is very densely packed with information and uses some pretty sciencey words too. I feel like some of it kind of went over my head. Anyway, Richard finally shows, and after some medical discussion, his missing daughter Celeste is brought up.
And her birth parents?
Dr. Reed, young girls often decide to just go. And this is what my daughter decided to do.
Jennifer.
What did you say?
At times, you'd call her Jennifer.
No, my
Mr.
daughter...
Felton, what has really happened to your daughter?
I just told you.
How about the off-the-record version?
I am not sure where you're trying to go with this, but I won't tolerate... I don't have the strength for this now.
It seems Rosemary was lying about being a doctor to learn more about Celeste, and sneaks back into the house at night to see what else she can dig up, only to find Richard's wife as a rotting corpse in bed. Richard is now skulking around the mansion with a sickle in hand, and all we want is to get out, so this is where we finally get a taste of the gameplay. If it wasn't already obvious, Remothered opts for a much more modern style of gameplay compared to Clock Tower. There's no point-and-click elements here at all, really, but something these games do share is the heavy emphasis on exploration and survival. Remothered very much rewards you for rummaging through drawers and cupboards, as this is really the only way you can find things to defend yourself with. Mind you though, there are no guns in this game, there's no weapons of any variety at all, really, as combat is non-existent. Instead, the name of the game, as you might have guessed, is to run and hide. Hiding spots are scattered all across the mansion. It could be hiding in a wardrobe, hiding under a couch, or hiding behind the furniture around you. You're even able to slightly open a door before entering a room just to scope out the area. It feels like a much more in-depth version of the hiding system in Haunting Ground, but one thing Remothered does so much better is that you can actually look around while in hiding. Oh my god, that is something that really bothered me with Haunting Ground. When you were hiding, you couldn't move the camera left and right to look around, which felt weirdly restrictive. I mean, isn't that exactly what you would do when you're in hiding? Here you can peek left and right to double check if there's a stalker nearby, which is a very small detail, but a very welcome one. Though I really liked the overall design of the mansion, it complements the hiding mechanics quite well. The mansion layout feels very intentionally designed to let the player get a bit creative. There's a lot of furniture jutting out from the walls or pillars in the middle of the room that allow for some spontaneous hiding spots when you need them. Take this, for example. I didn't realise Richard was right behind me when I was coming down the stairs, so I panicked and used this chair as a makeshift hiding spot. And I didn't expect it to work, but it did, and I felt a little bit of an adrenaline rush, like, ooh, is he gonna see me or not? I love when games have that little bit of flexibility and give you more options to hide if you're creative enough to see those options. It's something Haunting Ground dipped into a little bit in its gameplay, but Remothered feels like it took that design and ran further with it, and I really like this. There's also a tiny mini-game that happens when you're hiding sometimes as well. If the stalker gets super close to you, this little circle shows up where you have to keep the dot within the circle. But I didn't know this mechanic was a thing. There was no mention of it in any of the tutorials, so when it first happened to me here, I was trying to read the text, but before I could even finish reading it, the dot went out of the circle and I was found, and you know, maybe it's a good rule of thumb to not throw a mechanic and a tutorial like that at a player in the heat of the moment, but hey, at least I knew for next time. So what are the stalkers actually like? Well, once one of them is on your tail, they'll chase you endlessly until either you manage to create enough distance that they can't see you anymore, or you just hide, like we mentioned. When you're not mid-chase, the stalkers will be doing the rounds looking for you. Sometimes you can hear them mumbling to themselves in the distance, and that combined with footsteps are your main ways to gauge how close they are. But that also means that they can hear your footsteps, of course, so if you run, they'll probably hear it and come running too. So you'll be doing a lot of walking and crouching here. Same goes for the flashlight. If you have that on, there's a very real chance they'll notice it, obviously, so only use it when you really need it. There's also the music cues as well. Each stalker has their own unique theme that heightens and gets more intense as they're nearby, obviously reaching a crescendo when you're in full chase. Take Richard's music here. Notice the different elements of music kicking in the closer he gets.
Land for me and then a whole falling out.
And the music is really good in Remothered, by the way, ranging from genuinely suspenseful and tense to downright terrifying when you're being chased. Without spoiling who the stalkers are, here's a taste of some of the chase music in this game. So while there is no explicit combat in this game, there are some things you can do to defend yourself. There's two types of items you can pick up around the mansion: diversions and weapons. Diversions are indicated by this little orange symbol here and are divided into two types. You have throwable diversions, usually things like a glass cup or a wine bottle, which you can use to make noise and distract the stalker or just directly throw it at the stalker. Then there's placeable diversions, a music box for example, that'll make noise and catch the stalker's attention. Regardless of which type you use, you can only hold 3 diversion items max. Then there's defense items like knives or scissors, indicated by this red symbol, which you can only ever hold 1 of. Think of this like a last-ditch effort item. You can only use this when the stalkers actually caught you, and it'll ward them off, giving you a chance to run. Otherwise, it's an instant death. As you can imagine then, it's a generally good rule of thumb to keep yourself topped up with defense and diversion items all the time, which isn't terribly hard because there's more than enough lying around the mansion. Though, truth be told, I never found myself really using diversion items. I didn't see much point using one, nor did I ever find myself in a bad enough spot to warrant using one, but I'm still glad it's there to account for all playstyles. I imagine someone less acquainted with stealth gameplay would need to rely on these more, so the option is there for those that want it. Interestingly, there aren't any medkits or healing items in this game at all. Rosemary can take about 3 hits before she succumbs to her wounds, but you can save your game and fully heal at these mirrors scattered around the mansion. But here's the catch, you can only heal at each of them once before the mirror cracks. So there are technically a limited amount of heals in the entire game, meaning you have to ration them wisely. The only major complaint I could make about the stalkers is their behaviour is very predictable. I didn't feel there was much randomness to which paths they take ever, so once you know the general route they take around the mansion, you're kinda good to go. It wasn't like Haunting Ground where I feel the stalkers could show up in a room unexpectedly, adding a certain element of surprise to exploration. But to be fair, maybe this was an intentional design choice with Remothered. After all, Haunting Ground's areas were massive, whereas in Remothered, the mansion is quite small and compact. If the stalkers were too random, it would make navigating an absolute nightmare, so you know what, it's probably for the best. And I really do think this compact mansion design works wonders. The building is really easy to navigate as there's really only 3 floors. There's the entrance hallway, a small basement area, and the upper floor. There are some offshoot hallways here and there, but for the most part it's all pretty self-contained, and that works really well with the gameplay style, something I admittedly can't say for Clock Tower SNES that just had way too many hallways. But you could argue this is also a double-edged sword, because especially on a first playthrough, there are times when you can feel a bit suffocated. Because it's such a small area, you're never really that far from the enemy. You never really feel like you get much of a breather from them. So much so that I never even took my chances running because I'd probably come across a stalker real quick if I did that. Ultimately, it's not too bad, but I would say it's easy to feel a little overwhelmed on a first playthrough, especially when you don't really know what to do or where to go at first. And what kind of survival horror would it be if it didn't have puzzles, right? It's obviously not as simple as just leaving the house. Rosemary finds the entrance door is locked, so you have to explore the mansion to find your options of escape, with, of course, a few puzzles along the way. The puzzles aren't too bad, they're actually quite logical a lot of the time. There's nothing too obscure or wacky here. Take this puzzle for example, we need to power up a film projector which probably uses a fairly hefty battery. What's something else in the house that probably uses a fairly hefty battery? Maybe this grandfather clock, for example? You find the key to open up the grandfather clock and bingo, there's your battery. Nothing is too overtly complicated, there's no light bulbs and cans to be found here whatsoever. Silent Hill 2, I love you sweetie, but that puzzle is goofy as hell. All of this gameplay is in real time, by the way. If you ever need to mess around in your inventory or you want to read a document, you better do it when you know there's no stalker around. Naturally, of course, you also can't really interact with major items or unlock doors if you have a stalker on your ass. But unlike Haunting Ground, that's much less of an issue in Remothered, I found, probably because the stalkers are generally much less aggressive here. And credit where it's due, Remothered Tormented Fathers runs pretty damn well. I always have a bit of leeway for an indie game, you know, they can't be spending millions of dollars on playtesting like a AAA game can. But aside from a very occasional texture pop-in, I didn't encounter any serious issues. Probably the worst one I had was at one point when I interacted with an item, it kept making Rosemary rubber band around the place. The only thing that fixed it was backing out to the main menu and reloading my save, but it was easily fixed and never happened again. There are some tiny presentation issues. I did notice quite a few misspellings and mistakes in the subtitles, for example. Nothing too bad, of course, and hell, most people probably wouldn't even notice, but as someone who uses subtitles in games religiously, they were very noticeable to me. And as well, sometimes the sound mixing in cutscenes was a little jarring too, some sound effects being way louder than they needed to be, but again, nothing that overall severely affected the experience. On the flip side, the voice acting was phenomenal in this game. There are some exceptional performances here.
I promised that we would have seen each other again on top of the world. They're coming. I need to get out of here. I must leave this recording here. Please, Mom, come with me. Please, wake up. Mom, please.
So then, what exactly is going on in this crazy mansion? Let's talk about the story in Tormented Fathers a little bit. Spoiler warning for anyone who may not want to hear anything about it, skip here to move past any and all story discussion. Okay, let's go. So, finding a film reel, Rosemary gets one step closer to figuring out what happened to Celeste. Felton seems to be undergoing a mesmerization treatment where he reveals more about Celeste.
I never thought she'd come back. I felt it.
Do you mean Celeste came back after she disappeared?
She wasn't my little girl. No, she wasn't Celeste. She was Jennifer.
Mr. Felton, who are you talking about? Who's Jennifer?
Before we can finish watching, Felton interrupts us and confirms that he killed Celeste, or Jennifer, convinced she wasn't his real daughter. Suddenly, a masked red nun appears and chases us away. Really badass design, by the way. The red nun looks sick. Eventually shaking her off, we come across a strange woman who tells us that there's a hidden room in the house that was sealed away. This woman, however, is not to be trusted, as before long she becomes violent and lashes out at Rosemary. Finding this sealed room that turns out to be Celeste's old bedroom, Rosemary finds a tape recorder, finally allowing us to hear Celeste's side of the story, where it seems that upon returning home to the villa, both her and her mother were trapped on the premises by Felton. Not too long after, we find Felton's birth certificate where we can see his birth name was actually Jennifer Richardine Felton. As it turns out, Felton was born a girl but raised as a boy by their abusive father, resulting in a sort of split personality in their adulthood. Richard, as we've come to know them up until this point in the story, and Jennifer, the woman we met earlier. Yeah, I was warned coming into this game that there was some dodgy portrayal of transgender topics, and I now see what people meant by that. I'm not going to speak on this topic purely because I am not transgender and I don't feel like I should speak for a community that I'm not a part of, but if you feel this is something that might affect your enjoyment of Remothered or upset you, I've linked some resources in the description down below written by people who are far more educated in the topic than I am, if you would like to learn more about it. Anyway, moving on. With this newfound knowledge, Rosemary comes across Gloria again, the nurse from earlier, and warns her about Felton. Gloria seems to already be aware of all of this, and was even involved in the mesmerization sessions with Felton, much to Rosemary's surprise. Gloria ends up drugging her, revealing herself to be the red nun that was chasing us earlier on, and Rosemary wakes up in the dining room tied to a chair, with Felton on the opposite side. Gloria was never even really his nurse, but in fact one of the nuns from the convent that was contaminated with phenoxyl, and so manipulated Felton's fragile mental state to get revenge. Using mesmerization one more time, she orders Felton to kill both Rosemary and themselves in a murder-suicide, which we narrowly manage to escape. The final showdown happens between Rosemary and Gloria in the attic, where Rosemary manages to trick her into falling out the window, fatally wounding her. During this final dialogue with Gloria, she recognises Rosemary as one of her fellow nuns at the convent, and urges her to continue looking for Celeste despite everything that's happened. Rosemary goes back to Celeste's room one final time, finding a bag with the tag saying Flemington Girls Institute. Oh man, the story is messy in this one. Even writing that synopsis proved quite difficult, and that was me only telling you the absolute essential details. A lot of plot points are introduced only to end up being red herrings, and some of the dialogue feels like it was intentionally written to be confusing to, I presume, add to the mystery, but it just ends up making it super muddled instead. For example, Felton keeps saying they murdered Jennifer when in fact they murdered their wife. I mean, they can't have murdered Jennifer because we know Jennifer is alive and well in the ending. And Celeste also goes by Jennifer, but Jennifer is also Felton's alter ego, as we discussed earlier. And then in the ending, when Gloria recognises Rosemary the whole time, it just kind of feels really out of nowhere. I mean, how did she not recognise her sooner? Even in the very first cutscene with Madame Svenska, she mentions a promise she made that she doesn't want to forget, but it's never fully explained what she's really talking about here, that is, until we learn more about it in the sequel, but that's not good enough. You shouldn't open plot points in one game that don't get resolved or explained until the sequel. I think your game should stand strong on its own without needing to rely on prequels and sequels to tell a good story. Once I knew the finer details after playing the sequel Broken Porcelain, sure, a lot of things in Tormented Fathers made a lot more sense, but that sequel took 2 years to come out. What about all the people who played Tormented Fathers on release? 2 years is an awful long time to have to wait for some clarity on the plot. I just think you could have trimmed the fat of the story a little bit for the sake of keeping it more focused. I should not feel this confused finishing a game. This is not helped by a lot of the documents and notes in the game being really densely packed with information, some of which can get very technical, especially anything relating to the phenoxyl subplot. I'm all for setting up exposition and potential arcs for future titles, especially since Remothered was meant to be a trilogy, but this is not really how you do it, not if it means the player is just going to be questioning everything. Notice how I said Remothered was meant to be a trilogy? Yeah, and well, only 2 of those games have come out, with no word on the third one yet. Apparently due to the lackluster sales and the overall lukewarm reception to the second game, Remothered Broken Porcelain, Chris Darrell has since moved on to newer projects, officially announcing his departure from the Remothered series in January 2022. I mean, that doesn't mean a third Remothered is off the table, but it's certainly not looking so good. Which is really sad to hear, especially for big fans of the franchise, but it makes you wonder, what on earth went wrong with Broken Porcelain, released in 2020, that could have caused such lasting damage? Well, apparently that game released as a technical mess. Remothered Broken Porcelain was going to act as a prequel, following Celeste years before the events of Tormented Fathers, but bugs, glitches, freezing, and inconsistent enemy AI made the game absolutely bomb with critics and fans. I'm talking really bad reviews like 2s, 3s, and 4s across the board. But here's the thing, all those reviews are from its release. I'm playing the game 3 years later, in 2023. It's already been patched up and fixed apparently. Now, I did manage to get my hands on an earlier version of the game to see for myself how buggy this game was on release, but let's give it some credit. Let's play it in its fixed state first to see what Broken Porcelain is all about, and we'll have a look at the original buggy release version later on. Okay, so here we go. Instead of Rosemary at the main menu, we now have Celeste Felton. I actually noticed the background of the main menu is a little bit strange. Instead of just looping Celeste's animation, it just fades to black suddenly and starts over. Kind of a jarring way to do it, but hey, whatever I guess. I didn't mention this in Tormented Fathers, but I hate to admit, when I first saw this main menu, I was brought right back to Heavy Rain and those goofy ass, way too zoomed in loading screens that game had. Yeah, remember Heavy Rain? Me neither. Anyway, starting up the game, we are met with an old-timey TV advert for phenoxyl, so I guess we're gonna be getting more of that subplot in this game? Yay. we're met with Celeste Felton coming into the office of a Mr. Ashman.
This is not a tourist resort, nor a playground. Breaking an entry? Larceny! What plans did you have for that gun? For God's sake, Jennifer, tell me!
Wait, so we're going by Jennifer now? Wasn't her real name Celeste? Dude, holy shit, can we just settle on one name and leave it? Okay, not a great start on the story front. Anyway, Jennifer, I guess we have to call her that now, seems to be a bit of a wild child, having been expelled from Flemington Girls' Institute and now being a troublemaker to the workers of Ashman Inn, particularly her close friend Lynn. After sulking in her room for a while, Jennifer comes across the housemaid Andrea, who seems to have gone mad, chasing down Jennifer in a murderous rage. This first portion of the game acts as a sort of refresher on the gameplay mechanics, and generally speaking, Broken Porcelain plays mostly the same as Tormented Fathers. We still have our diversion and defense items, we still hide in lockers and wardrobes, and the stalkers chase you down relentlessly just like they did last time. But there have been some interesting adjustments made here. The first and most surprising mechanic that's new is there's technically kind of combat now. If you have a defense item like a knife or scissors on you and you manage to sneak up behind a stalker without them knowing, you can attack them and it'll knock them down for a few moments. As a result of this, there's also boss fights now. We get our first taste of both very quickly when we need to take down Andrea to steal some keys from her. And, this stealth attack mechanic does itself no favours. When you sneak up behind the enemy, there's no clear indicator that you can do a stealth attack at all until it's way too late. Sometimes the button prompt doesn't even show up. The tutorial's also totally useless. It doesn't specify any buttons, so I straight up had no clue what to do. I think a more clear button prompt would have worked wonders here. If you didn't pay attention to the tutorial, you wouldn't honestly have any clue that a stealth attack exists at all. But to be honest, I'm not in love with the idea of boss fights as a whole. Well, definitely not the Andrea boss fight anyway. This is a stealth game, so combat doesn't really feel like it belongs to begin with. Andrea's fight is also very repetitive. The only way to do it without taking a ton of damage is finding a diversion item, placing it down to catch Andrea's attention, and then attacking her when she turns her back. But dude, she is a tank. It takes a good few hits before she's down for good, and it's just as repetitive as it sounds. I ended up getting impatient and just rushing her with defense items since it turns out that did damage too, and there's just way less messing around that way. It feels like boss fights just don't work with the stealth-focused gameplay of Remothered, so I hope there's not too many more of these. Naturally though, because there's more face-to-face combat, there's also a dodge mechanic to go with it, and this seemed to work pretty consistently anytime I used it. You can only dodge a certain number of times as it reduces Jennifer's new stamina meter. Well, I think so. It sure as hell doesn't affect Jennifer's sprint, that girl was zooming everywhere. The panic minigame returns as well anytime a stalker gets too close to your hiding spot, but thankfully its design is way more visually clear. It doesn't just hit you with a tutorial mid-minigame. There we go, that's exactly what Tormented Fathers needed, so I'm glad they fixed that up here. Since we're talking about new mechanics, let's talk about the Moth Eye ability real quick. A short while into the story, Jennifer realizes she has the ability to manipulate bugs and insects thanks to her mother having taken phenoxyl while pregnant. Can you tell this game was inspired by phenomena? This introduces us to the Moth Eye mechanic, allowing you to take control of a moth and scope out the room you're in for a limited time, even interacting with things in the environment to distract the stalkers or help you with puzzles. And you definitely need it in some parts. Unlike Tormented Fathers, Broken Porcelain really likes to throw a lot of stalkers at you at once, at one point having 3 enemies patrolling one area. This Moth Eye ability is a pretty cool addition though, kinda sucks that it's a bit underutilized. But hey, at least we've got another pretty cool setting again. This time, instead of the gloomy Felton Villa, we're in the quaint but cozy snowy resort of the Ashman Inn. A big change of scenery from the previous game, and I'm totally here for it. The Italian flags in the corner of some of the rooms, the wooden decor and red brick walls. The place definitely feels more homely, and personally, I think it has a lot more character visually than the Felton Villa, so props to the designers for that one. This is a very pretty game. I'm most surprised by the cutscenes though. Animations are way more fluid and the dialogue is not nearly as cluttered this time around. That's something I noticed with Tormented Fathers. Sometimes it felt like characters were racing to cut over each other, but here the conversations overall sound a lot more natural. They're still definitely name-dropping things constantly and it can be easy to fall behind if you're not paying attention, but at least the cutscenes are a little easier to digest this time. Not only is there more world building, but we've also got a romance subplot, baby. That's right, this game has lesbians. And I love seeing more LGBT storylines in games, and I wish I could say it was a super wholesome love story that blossoms between Jennifer and Lynn, but it just kind of feels a bit half-assed here. We see the girls getting to know each other and even planning to run away from the inn together in a series of flashbacks, but it's just a little too fast. Like, Jennifer is super standoffish in one cutscene, and then in the next one she's flirting, and then in the next one they're saying things like this.
You are the only thing that has ever made me feel alive.
It's just kind of fast, you know? Like, I feel like I barely got to know these characters individually, never mind their relationship. And so when you give me these admittedly very cute cutscenes of them together, it's not really leaving any lasting impact on me. I think some more scenes developing their relationship would have helped me get more invested in these two. But, you know, we love the gays, so I'm not really complaining. The puzzles are solid once again here, nothing too mind-blowing or difficult, and just enough of a head-scratcher to keep you involved without getting too obscure. I'd say overall that the puzzles are more creative in this one, instead of just the fetch quest from Tormented Fathers. I quite like the phone puzzle at the beginning. You have to try open a safe in one of the rooms, but obviously you don't know the code. The stickers on the safe say to dial the helpline and they'll give you an emergency code, so you have to go back to the lobby and use this rotary phone. Very retro. I like little details like this that remind us of the time period we're in. This is the early 70s after all. You know something I went way too long without realizing though? Broken Porcelain has skills and stats and upgrades. Yeah, and you wouldn't even realize it because the game never tells you they exist at all. You can find moth keys scattered around the place that you can spend on upgrading things like stamina, speed, health recovery, moth eye proficiency and all that, but it would have been nice to know this a little sooner. By the time I figured out what the moth keys were for, I was already over halfway into the game. I could definitely see these upgrades being useful on repeat playthroughs though, because Broken Porcelain actually has collectibles. You can collect these little snow globes which unlock character statues in the main menu. It's not much, but it's a little more than Tormented Fathers. That game didn't really have anything to do once you beat it, so I appreciate the effort here at least. Especially since in Remothered you can only heal yourself with mirrors, so just make a difficulty where there's less mirrors to heal at, or hell, even no mirrors at all. I think that's a challenge a lot of hardcore fans would get a kick out of, but once you beat these games once, there's no real reason to go back to them, to be honest. Considering they cost about 20 to 30 euro each, a bit of an incentive to replay them wouldn't have gone amiss. And well, considering how poorly received Broken Porcelain was on release and remembering that I am playing the patched version, how does it fare? Credit where it's due, they must have fixed the game up pretty well because I didn't really have any hiccups at all playing this. There were some slightly goofy moments like seeing Jennifer spawn in when I restarted a checkpoint, or Andrea's AI trapping me in a room and I had no option but to make a break for it, but nothing too severe to be honest. No bugs or issues that I would call worse than Tormented Fathers anyway. So if you wanted to get this game and held off because of the bugs and issues, take it from me. This game runs pretty well now and you've nothing to worry about. It does make me wonder how buggy the initial release was though.
Memories and time go hand in hand. The consequences would be even more devastating than Alzheimer's disease.
They mustn't find me. Not my Even Andrea must have been really something. To my advantage.
Very good.
That's what the hypnosis was for.
During the hypnosis, even from great distances. Imagine if we could create a bridge between the human mnemonic apparatus and the communicative system of those beings, with rapid impulses and synapses, a transmission of images without the use of senses. That would be telepathy-ness.
But most insects need a leader to guide them. Take bees, for example. They have a queen to guide them.
Very good.
That's what the hypnosis was for.
Yeah, nah, stick with the patch version. At last, we're getting insight into Celeste, or Jennifer, or whatever. So what was she getting up to in the 70s? Is the story any good in Remothered Broken Porcelain? Simple answer, no. The story is just as messy, if not worse, than Tormented Fathers. Not only is there a million subplots going on at once, but we're also jumping around to different points in time really often, so keeping up with the time skips feels like an exercise in and of itself. Kinda disappointing, but let me try to summarise the story before I go any further. Here's your spoiler warning for Remothered Broken Porcelain, skip to here if you don't want to hear anything about it. Alright, let's get to it. It seems it wasn't just Andrea who has gone mad at Ashman Inn, but in fact everyone there. Not only is Jennifer being hunted down by the others, but also a strange hooded man who looks like he jumped right out of Elden Ring. Ashman himself is a particularly aggressive stalker, shooting wildly at you, and oh my god, his boss fight is a pain in the ass. We have to use the fire extinguisher to fight back at him. No, not hitting him over the head with it, as you might think, but spraying him with it, which, you know, I'm struggling to understand how that would hurt him exactly, but pop off. But his bullets do so much damage, and you don't exactly have a lot of room to work with, so another miss of a boss fight. There's also the Red Nun back again, for some reason, so that's another person chasing us down. Shaking both of them off, we come across one of the maids, Elise, who tells us that all of the staff are being brainwashed by the loudspeakers throughout the inn. Turns out Elden Ring boss over here is indeed Wyman, the ex-business partner of the Ashmans and Feltons, who is the scapegoat for the phenoxyl experiments going wrong, a plot point we touched upon in the first game. Taking the fall for the incident, Wyman had no option but to fake his own death and hide in the Ashman Inn. Which, like, huh? Why does Wyman have to stay at the inn? Wouldn't it make more sense to run away from the people who betrayed you? I don't know, like, why, man? Thank you. Wyman, or Porcelain as he's called here, is the one behind the brainwashing. Think of it like a group hypnosis, and everyone at Ashman Inn is under his spell, except Jennifer, who's immune. He's also easily the worst boss fight in the game, not because it's hard, not because it's complicated, but purely because it's pretty damn goofy. You're just running around in circles around the car for a few minutes shooting out the lights while Lynn sits in the car perfectly content with not helping you. Then Porcelain just kinda goes whoop into the vents every once in a while. Easily one of the weirdest boss arenas I've ever seen, and it goes on for way too long. So that Elise girl who was helping earlier is actually Gloria, by the way. Yes, the same Gloria from Tormented Fathers, don't ask questions. And despite Jennifer and Lynn trying to escape, she manages to capture them and bring them back to the inn for the final confrontation. After some very heavy-handed exposition, the finale of the story ends up being a free-for-all between all of the inn staff, with everyone effectively trying to hypnotize each other so they can have the upper hand. Gloria seizes control of Porcelain with her moth mind control powers, but Lynn steps in and steals control of Porcelain from her, leading to the final boss fight of sorts where you have to hunt down Gloria around the inn as Porcelain. This section is very slow-paced and frustrating since Gloria is very fast and we are very not. Lynn isn't able to kill her in the end though, and Gloria vows to hunt down Jennifer's parents as revenge.
I think I'll start by killing your parents, Celeste.
Sorry, Celeste. The two girls share their goodbyes as Jennifer heads home to her parents, setting the stage for the events of the first game. Throughout the story, there are a number of time skips to the 90s to Rosemary, who we now know is an adult Lynn. Interviewing an elderly Ashman, heavily disfigured after the events of Broken Porcelain, Lynn manages to coerce him into telling her about what became of Jennifer all these years later. He tells her that she now lives in Sweden under a fake name, that fake name being Madame Svenska. Yes, as many people probably figured out by now, Madame Svenska is an elderly Jennifer. Ashman also reveals they kidnapped and murdered a number of other Jennifers before they managed to find the real one. In the present day, both Lynn and Jennifer, now elderly women, meet one final time before Lynn passes away. The man who's been interviewing Madame Svenska the entire time is the younger brother of one of the Jennifers who was murdered, presumably setting up the premise for the third Remothered, a game we may or may not get. Were you able to follow all of that? My god, for such a short game, this is easily one of the most convoluted plots I've ever seen. And if it doesn't seem that convoluted, that's because I tried my damn best to summarize it as simply as possible. I thought Tormented Fathers was hard to follow, but Broken Porcelain is on another level. Between the constant name changes, character reveals, the Red Nun appearing again, and the whole moth hypnosis plot, it's like mental gymnastics keeping up with this, so much so that I well and truly gave up trying to follow it by the last stretch of the story. I left out so many details and subplots for the sake of brevity in my synopsis, and it still reads like a narrative maze. Yeah, unfortunately, Broken Porcelain, much like its predecessor, suffers from a chaotic and muddled plot that moves at a breakneck speed, and the time skips between the 70s, 90s, and modern day makes it 10 times worse. I can see what they were trying to do here, I really can, and I'm not normally one to go in on a game story like this, but I mean it. Broken Porcelain's plot is rough and easily the worst aspect of the game. The emotional scenes between Lynn and Jennifer bump it up a little bit, but it's not enough to save the overarching narrative. But what frustrated me more after finishing this one was realizing how many plot points are opened in Tormented Fathers that don't get resolved until Broken Porcelain. I touched upon this a little bit while wrapping up the first game, but finishing the second game really hammers the point home of how messy and disorganized Remothered's story is. For example, we know that Rosemary was the one who burned down the convent in Tormented Fathers, but we never find out why the hell she did that until close to the end of Broken Porcelain. And sure, this new knowledge recontextualizes the first game, and I certainly came to have a better appreciation of certain plot points there. But I shouldn't have to play a whole other game to do that. Don't make a game with the presumption it's going to get a sequel. Shouldn't it stand on its own as an independent title too? Imagine in the first Resident Evil, the very first one from 1996, Wesker went on a super vague rant about Ouroboros, a plot point that doesn't become relevant until Resident Evil 5. You know, you can do it, but don't be surprised if people get confused and frustrated at your storytelling. I hope the point I'm making here is clear. I'm just trying to explain how frustrating the narrative choices were in Remothered and how it would have benefited far more from a more straightforward, linear plot that just branched across the games. But please remember, this is my opinion. I am a stickler for storytelling. I always have been. I'll admit that right now. And if you enjoyed the story in Remothered, great. So did I. I enjoyed the ride. I didn't really understand it, but I enjoyed it. But I'm also able to critique it. But enough about the story, let's even things out a little bit here. Broken Porcelain plays much like its predecessor, and if you enjoyed Tormented Fathers, you'll probably enjoy this one, assuming you've played the patched version, of course. Let me remind you that Remothered was, once upon a time, a remake of the classic Clock Tower on SNES, and while it may fall down in the narrative, it makes up for it in its gameplay, art direction, and music. Remothered is exactly what I'd expect a modern-day Clock Tower to play like. And while the games may have their flaws, they also have a lot of heart. You can tell Chris Darrell lives and breathes horror, and it more than shows in his work. Like this Clock Tower poster in Tormented Fathers, or this poster of Daniela from Haunting Ground in Broken Porcelain. And you know what, I would rather a game with a lot of heart that maybe stumbles along the way a little bit than another Flavor of the Month soulless AAA title. Remothered isn't perfect, but what is? Unfortunately, Chris Darrell left the Remothered project behind him in 2022. He's even gone on record outright saying he hates Broken Porcelain, so the future of the franchise is uncertain for now, which is a damn shame. But he's not letting that bump in the road stop him. In fact, he's been working on a brand new original game by Sweet Carol, which is going to be a Disney-inspired survival horror, and man, looking at the little snippets he shared on Twitter, that is shaping up to be a real gem. Damn, well, that's that. We've officially covered every Clock Tower and Clock Tower associated game. Psych! There's technically one more game, and screw waiting for a new video now, we're checking this shit out now. Would you believe me if I told you that there was a new Clock Tower that released only 2 years ago? Clock Tower ready for the next on Android. Yeah, it's a fun game. Alright, let's dive right in. Pure unfiltered tango let's play, baby. Let's see what this is all about. Jennifer, hurry up and hide. 3 places to hide. It's not really a complete sentence, is it? That sounds kind of cute. This box. Genius, Jennifer, you'll never see you. Oh, it worked! Wow. Okay. Be under the mat. Okay, Jennifer. Okay. Up above. Surely. Sure. Maybe up on the... Can you go up on the... Oh, you can go up in the box. Yeah, perfect. Like, these stubby little legs aren't going to get up there. Stupid Bobby. Alright. Success. Look forward to the next one. And there you go. Not really much to say about that one, is there? I mean, it's free, it's totally free, and the art style's cute, so I suppose it's something. I mean, this came out in September 2021, and a lot of people think the name Ready for the Next is hinting at a potential new game, you know, like Ready for the Next Clock Tower, maybe? But I don't know, I'll believe it when I see it, right? Though, in fairness, there has been leaks recently that a horror IP that hasn't had a new game in 10 plus years will be getting a remake, and that same horror IP apparently had a recent phone game, and, well, you know...
Yadohe, Adohe, Adonai Ton. Adohe, Adonai Ton.
Nah, but real shit, I actually want to take this opportunity to give a special shout out to Team C.U.T.S. They're a preservation team doing God's work with the Clock Tower franchise. They upload like memorabilia and old footage and ads and anything you could think of when it comes to the history of the Clock Tower franchise. A few members of the community actually recently created a completely free to download undub of Clock Tower Ghosthead, so I'm going to drop their socials beneath. Follow them on Twitter, join the Discord. As far as I'm concerned, these guys are single-handedly keeping the Clock Tower franchise alive at this stage, so do check them out. Very cool dudes. Nah, but that's gonna do for the Clock Tower Marathon for me. You know, I'm looking forward to covering new topics. I have a lot of video ideas, some horror and some not horror, actually. I know, Tango covering a game that's not horror, shock and terror. And thank you to anyone who found my channel along the way. These Clock Tower videos have been insanely successful, more than I can comprehend. My mind was blown when the Nightcry video hit 100k views. My mind was blown when it hit 10k, because, you know, only a few months prior I was celebrating the Nightmare Decay video hitting 1k, and so I never would have humoured the thought of any of my videos hitting 100k, so insane. Thank you. I hope I can keep making videos, and I hope you guys keep liking them, hopefully. We'll see. As for what we're diving into next, I've been keeping an eye in the comment sections and I've been amazed that there's one game in particular getting an awful lot of requests from you guys. So tune in next time where we're going to be jumping back in time to the PS2 once again to have a look at Rule of Rose. Oh baby! Thank you so much for watching. I sincerely hope you enjoyed this video on Remothered. If you like what I do and you want to watch more of me for some ungodly reason, I actually stream over on Twitch as well, a few times a week. We play mainly horror games, retro and indie, and everything in between. And if you just want to keep up with me in general, feel free to follow me over on Twitter. But thank you so much for watching, and tune in next time as we have a look at Rule of Rose on the PS2. Bye-bye.